Just like Liz Cheney, I believe in telling the truth. I think real leadership is about telling the truth. And, any Republican talking out of the front of their lips or the sides of their lips about the election fraud issues that have been debunked is not leadership. It only shows that you're able to take commands from Donald Trump.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in the East. One of the two major political parties in the United States has made it abundantly clear it will put the man who lost them control of the White House and control of the Senate over the simple truth. Who you just heard from there was Georgia's Republican Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan, one of the few Republicans willing to put honesty and principle over politics, as almost the entire rest of the GOP clings to Donald Trump's lies and is now on a crusade to oust Congresswoman Liz Cheney from her position as GOP conference chair. Cheney's crime, being the lone House Republican in leadership to tell the truth about the president's lies and the violence he incited on January 6th. Punchbowl News was first to report that Congressman Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, the top two House Republicans, are quietly working behind the scenes to boost New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik's bid for House Republican Conference Chair. Scalise openly supporting Stefanik, to which Liz Cheney's spokesman responded, quote, "Liz will have more to say in the coming days. This moment is about much more than a House leadership fight." Indeed. The former guy has also weighed in, announcing his endorsement of Stefanik to replace Cheney. But this push by top House Republicans, which even more firmly plants and cements their feet in the ground of Trumpian lies, could cost them everything. So says conservative bastion, the Wall Street Journal editorial board. They write this, quote, "GOP leaders shouldn't have to lie about 2020 to keep their job. Republicans will look foolish, or worse, to swing voters if they refight 2020 and 2022. Mr. Trump lost the popular vote in a rout in the Electoral College by a similar margin to what he won in 2016. Mr. Trump lost even as Republicans gained 12 seats in the House. The election was close, but not as close as others in American history. Republicans should find a way to speak this truth to voters in 2022 and quickly turn to running on an agenda for the future that will check Mr. Biden in his cradle-to-grave entitlement state. Purging Liz Cheney for honesty would diminish the party." This morning, our friend and colleague Joe Scarborough weighed in on that exact point, that in their pile-on of Liz Cheney, Republicans are losing themselves.
Here we find ourselves, as the Wall Street Journal editorial page has, with just a veritable cornucopia to feast on from a Democratic presidency that's the most liberal since LBJ. If there were a conservative there, this is all, I guarantee you, when I was there, this is all we would be talking about. And we would be on the floor night and day talking about runaway government. They instead are talking about a woman with a lifetime 95% ACU rating, like me, by the way, who's simply telling the truth about the 2020 election. This is madness.
It's goodbye to the Republican Party you once knew and hello to a party completely captured by one man. More importantly, his lies, stopping at nothing to appease him. As Thomas Friedman writes in the New York Times today, that could have massively damaging consequences to our very democracy. Quote, "We are closer to a political civil war more than at any other time in our modern history. There's simply nothing more dangerous for a two-party democracy than to have one party declare that no election where it loses is legitimate, and therefore, if it loses, it will just lie about the results and change the rules." That is exactly what's playing out now. The GOP's further descent into lies is where we start this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Eugene Daniels is back, White House reporter for Politico and Playbook co-author is here. Also joining us, Olivia Troy, former top aide to Vice President Mike Pence, now the director of the Republican Accountability Project, and former Republican Congressman Denver Riggleman. Congressman, I have to start with you. I don't know that the Republican Party can go back to fighting about spending after not caring about spending during Donald Trump's presidency. But I think Joe Scarborough's point is there's enough spending that they could try if they cared about anything principled. And I don't think they could go back to fighting on national security turf, because Donald Trump turned them into a party that looks the other way when Vladimir Putin encroaches on our allies. So do you buy that theory that they could be having policy fights if they wanted to? They choose this? I don't think that party exists anymore.
I think it's very difficult to say that it exists. And I don't know if any of you have seen this just on Twitter. You know, the sewer of American politics runs through my phone, by the way. I want everybody to know that.
Yes.
But just on Twitter, we found that there's people actually fundraising saying that Liz Cheney, Republicans right now on Twitter are fundraising saying that Liz is destroying their movement. And the only thing I could think of, because Nicolle, I've been on here before. I've been on a lot of shows, and I sometimes have a way with words to try to get my point across. But it looks like a sort of an intellectual bowel movement, you know, for the Republicans right now. And when you see the individuals that are fundraising against Liz, these are the very individuals that sort of, I would say, called for the insurrection or perpetuated this big lie that's happened since November 3rd and is still happening today. And it's very difficult, right, to have a discussion on policy when you have an audit going on in Arizona when they're looking for bamboo pulp in the ballots or using UV light to see if there's some secret markings put on there by the Illuminati. It's very difficult to have this discussion. And you have two great people on this show to talk about it. But if we're just going to talk about facts, we're still in that echo chamber of facts. People aren't watching this. And I think it's up to Republican leaders at the grassroots level to start to call out the ridiculousness, the insanity, and the morons that seem to be in charge of the Republican Party. It's almost like they were trained wrong as a joke. And they took that for real, and they took that as reality. And I'm just out of an ability to define the idiocy that I'm seeing across the Republican Party right now. And it's to the point, I think, like Liz, we just don't give a damn. We just want to fight. You know, we're three people in a bar and we see six over there that are crazy. We're like, we're going to get our butts kicked. We're going to fight them anyway, because we're just tired of listening to the nonsense.
Well, and I think I mean, you and I talked last about the fact-immune GOP, something we both deal with professionally and personally. But I think that I know Liz Cheney, and I think that what people don't appreciate is that the few Republicans like Liz who are speaking out are doing so from a national security concern. I mean, the Republican Party, by refusing to take a sledgehammer to anyone who incites an insurrection on the Capitol are no different from anyone who after 9/11 had refused to do anything about the people who flew planes into buildings. That's where that party is. And the notion that Kevin McCarthy wants to go investigate Black Lives Matter protesters, they didn't storm the Capitol. The people that were there were loud and proud waving Trump flags. We know who they were because they wanted us to know who they were. And I wonder if you can speak to the security concerns of this complete deterioration of the modern Republican Party.
Yeah, you know, I'm the chief strategist for the Network Contagion Research Institute, and I think you might have heard, Nicolle, I don't know if we talked about it last time, that we had a minimum of 7 white nationalist groups that were in that throng of people that sieged the Capitol. So when you have that many groups, now that was a minimum. Now we knew that there were some other groups that we couldn't prove specifically, but we saw 7 that were part of the planning, right? And if we did an in-depth social network analysis, my feeling is if we looked at call detail records and things like that, and what I did in my past in intelligence, that we would see that there's a lot of I would say issues or a lot of connections that are there that people don't want to see. And when you go back to national security, here's the issue with Liz Cheney calling for a January 6th commission. I think there would be national security issues because I think a lot of the Republican members don't want to be subpoenaed. I think that was really the straw that broke the camel's back for McCarthy, is when Liz came out against him on the need for a 1/6 commission. As far as foreign policy and foreign terrorism, we're looked inwardly so much right now on the domestic terrorism side. It's absolutely possible that we're missing things on cyber, we're missing things non-kinetically, or even maybe kinetic attacks that could be being planned internally or externally, because we're so focused right now on the crazy that's happening with people who still believe this and could be activated right through the radical language that's used for these conspiracy theories. So, yeah, my God, yes, I'm concerned. I've been in counterterrorism for 20 years, and I'm looking at people that are talking the exact same way that I saw from 2001 to 2012, when I was actually completely involved in counterterrorism and just sort of saturated with that mission set. So, yeah, Nicolle, I don't know what else to say. We're in trouble if we continue down this path. But I think we're already in trouble. That's what I'm trying to say.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.